Well, good afternoon and welcome to the WiseWork webinar. I see we have quite a list of people who have joined us. So thank you very much for coming and sharing this half-hour session with me. So if you haven't used this system before, let me just explain what you're looking at on your screens. You should be able to hear me and see my video live in the top right hand corner of your screen, and below me are two boxes. The top one is the Q&A box. If you want to put a question or comment to me in there, then it will go direct to me. Or if you want to make an observation or a chat to somebody else, welcome this as an opportunity to share your ideas with other people. I see Ros Osborne has already put testing in the box. And it's an opportunity to both hear what I have to say, but also contribute ideas as well. This is very much interactive using this technology. It allows us to make the best of taking just half an hour out of our busy days, not having to travel to go to a seminar or to some event. So welcome everybody. The idea is this is one of a series of webinars that we're running from WiseWork, and you can see on the screen, and the main part of the screen is the slides, that this is part of a process. We're calling this a year in the life of a project, what we're loosely calling Wise Working project. We've had experience over the last 20 plus years in working with a number of clients on implementing new ways of working, and there's a process that we've tended to use to try and get this happening in a fairly systematic way. And to do that, we have built some processes that are helping us to work consistently with the whole set of clients. So over this year, we're going to take you through 6 webinars. If you look at the WiseWork website, you'll see the timings for those, so that by the end of the year, we've built up the picture of how you might work in an organization over the period of a year. And also at the end of each webinar, we'll produce a write-up. So by the end of the year, we'll have an e-book of the things that we've covered in the webinar so over the year. So in a short half an hour, I've got time to spend the next 10, maximum 15 minutes talking to you. So I'm going to talk quite fast in order to get our ideas over. Then I'd like your questions in the Q&A box or your comments in the chat box so we can share a few ideas together for the last 10 minutes or so of the session. So getting underway, we are really looking at this very first stage of the process as being really deciding whether you should even be starting or not. It's critical to do the groundwork in getting your project properly researched before jumping into making changes. Too often we get called in to help organizations that already have started, made a bit of a false start sometimes on implementing flexible new ways of working, only to find that the organization isn't ready, they're trying to go too fast, people are not convinced, there are lots of objections, and so on. So this first stage is really important in laying the foundations. Otherwise, it's only going to come back and cause you problems later. And one of the first things is to look at this quite confusing market of different ways of working. There are hundreds, actually probably thousands of different names for these new working practices. We've amassed a whole load ourselves. And it's an opportunity to think about the risks involved in some of these things, as well as the positives. So looking at how far you should be going on smart, wise, agile, flexible working. Is your organization ready for a major change, or does it have to go much more gradually because some of this is too big a challenge to the current culture? They're just starting to think about all the different options out there, and we're starting in this process to home in on which one is most relevant to you. And there are three key things that we find need to be in place. Aspects of the people, the workforce, the human resources issues, the facilities, the property, the workplace issues, and those that are driven by technology. And so often we find that there's an HR-driven project that hasn't been fitted in with the facilities people, or there's a move to a new building and the real estate people are not taking into account the impact. And in amongst all this, technology changes are happening, and it's a problem with the technology just driving things too fast, and the people are not ready for it, or the facilities aren't there. So it's really getting these three circles working together as part of your project. And really thinking about what do we mean by flexible working? It comes with a whole set of baggage. It means different things to different people. And we think there are three factors that we need to think about and make it quite simple, really. It's all to do with when are you doing your work? Is it the normal working hours? Is it varied times? Is it very varied times during the year? As with, say, somebody working different hours in term time than holiday time. Where obviously it's flexibility is one of those key things to help people fit work around the rest of their lives. Then there's location, where people work. More and more people are working from home, working on the move with technology, and more and more offices are becoming full of hot desks, so people are not tied to one particular place. Activity-based working means people can work at the space that's most appropriate for the activity at the time, for example. And then there's the variation on how much work is getting done, full-time versus part-time, job sharing, and all other combinations of different amounts of work. I think we've moved away from the era where everybody assumed that work had to be divided into units of full-time working, into breaking things down into many more part-time changes of activity. Then we move to looking at what's already happening. It's really important as part of what you're currently doing to understand what is in place formally, but also what's going on in practice informally. In every organization we've looked at, there are some policies, obviously, with looking at things like flexible working, the legal right to request. HR has policies in place. You then go and talk to a variety of people and they say, oh yes, that's what the policy is, but here's what we actually do in practice. Don't tell HR. And this is something that you really need to understand before starting on a project. What is really going on in the organization? And sometimes we turn over stones and find some interesting examples of new ways of working happening in organizations that they simply didn't know about. And when we find it, they're really quite interested to know how well some of these things have worked. All sorts of constraints on how flexible you can be, which are part of this kind of formal structure. And whether it's things to do with the workspace and the way it's laid out, the opening hours of the building, and you can only do certain things in the building. And there are a lot of technology constraints as well, in terms of you can only use this particular technology in this way. And what actually happens in practice, of course, inventive employees, imaginative managers find ways around this. They find, with things like bring your own device or choose your own device. Now, a lot of people are using technology in a way that suits them, and that's fine, but it might actually break the apparent technology policies of the company. And when it gets to things like security of data and so on, it's important that some of these policies are understood and not broken. So it is a question of finding out what formal structures are in place which are helping and or hindering the use of new flexible working practices, and understanding what is already going on before moving on to then putting the things in place. And then probably the most key thing out of today is making sure you've got a solid business case. Our belief at WiseWork is very clearly that new ways of working are all to do with enhancing the business. In the process, they improve the working lives of the individuals, they contribute to society, all that stuff, all the soft goals. There are some really hard business goals that are important, it's understood. It's important to understand what's going on in the marketplace, because to be competitive, organizations need to make sure they have a good set of attractive policies for their employees. They need to understand what the change can be made and what's the potential for changing in the business. And what are the constraints? There will be objections, problems, barriers to putting things in place, and understanding what those are is part of making sure that whatever success you put for your project, whatever measurements you put for your project, they have to be clear. You have to understand what is needed as a result. And then before we get to putting together project plans and so on, looking at, if it makes business sense, is there still sufficient support in the organization to go ahead with the changes? Is the resource there? Are there going to be major objections? So understanding that even if you think there's a good business case, that will be accepted by the rest of the organization. And one way we use of setting these goals and measures is something we call the balanced scorecard, something you've probably met before in other circumstances. And this is just a way of looking at these four factors: the external, customer, community impact, the finance, the physical, the funding of the business goals, and the finance, the hard figures we're talking about there. The softer things to do with the people, human resource, the organizational issues, and then things to do with process and efficiency and so on. Moving on to explain what we mean here. Let's take the external, the customer community. Things that change with new ways of working and can therefore help with the impact outside are things like being able to adapt hours which are more appropriate for customers, for the community. We've worked with local authorities, for example, that provide services to the local customers, rate players. And what happens, of course, is if people want to access services in the evenings, if you've got people working flexibly, then chances are then people will be there outside of the normal working hours to meet the customer's needs. Looking at the people, the organizational issues, obviously there are benefits for individual employees, but also for the organization in terms of employee turnover and absence, things like that going down. There are some measurable things here. So this is not just soft, wouldn't it be nice for employees, but there's some really hard business measures in the human resource area to contribute to the bottom line. After all, we're talking here about really making sure that this move to new ways of working is to do with the goals of the business as a whole. And so when we're looking at things like work in progress for the business, productivity for the business, accuracy, all these things that are to do with the quality of work, they will often improve significantly when people are working in ways that suit them better, so with more flexible working practice. And then finally, the hard figures. There's often cost savings involved in cutting back on real estate, for example, and hence a higher return on investment for the organization. Coming up with tangible figures is important because these often speak to the people at the top. And it's important that coming up with the business case is something that's done in the language of the businesses who are going to need to be convinced that this change and their investment in the change is worth it. So we really need to think about how do we get this compelling case. And I guess to start with, it's a question of, if you're putting together a proposal, you know a lot of the background, you know the world of work is changing, you know there are people out there who are working much more flexibly. You may have seen problems in recruiting people, but this may not be that visible to some of the key managers, senior managers in the organization, and it's worth, therefore, documenting some of that, documenting some of the thinking, the logic behind the proposal, as opposed to assuming that just everybody knows about it. And as a result of that, really getting to demonstrate the business case using the balanced scorecard, if you like, and making sure that the people who make the key business decisions in the organization, and that's not always the bean counters, but certainly line managers, understand that this is part of their business goals. It's owned by the business, not by you in HR or facilities or somewhere else as some sort of separate project. This is key to the success of the business. There will be barriers. There will be people who are not convinced, and you need to understand those and be realistic about the fact that people will object, and can't just say, well, rubbish. Understand that, and other people will say this is risky, it's a change we don't know what we're letting ourselves in for. Don't just say, well, tough, other people have done it, it must be all right. Understand the risks and be realistic about them. There will be things that you are embarking on which are a bit of a leap into the unknown, and certainly for nervous managers, certainly those that like to maintain a tight control, have a tight ship, as it were, they will be people who have a problem with some of these changes, particularly when we're talking about trusting and empowering employees and losing some of that control. Some managers do feel very nervous about that. So understand that. And it's once you've understood this environment that then we're getting ready to produce an outline project plan. But don't rush into saying, oh, let's go flexible working, let's produce a project plan. We've got to do this fundamental foundation work first. Otherwise, the project plan is likely to fall over. And that's all really we want to cover in this very first section, because next time we move on to the next stage, which is initiating, and that's all about having got the idea together, having got the business ideas, having got the objectives, then starting to do the things here, finding the champions, getting people on side, getting the more detailed project plan, and finally getting at the end of the next stage to the top team approval. Don't go too quick into doing presentations to the top team about, well, this is all wonderful, until you are aware of the kind of objections you're going to get. I don't want to say lobbying exactly, but understanding the environment you're working in. Some of this stuff is a major challenge, is a major change for managers, and they're very, very nervous about it. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm now interested to see if I have any questions or comments. And at the moment, I have Chris Ridgewell made a comment about whatever's put in place must be reflected in individuals' terms and conditions. Yeah, a good point. I maybe have sort of glossed a bit over the legal aspects of all of this, because in the end, what's happening here is when you're planning for, remember we're only talking at the planning stage, when you're planning for this kind of change, it will mean making some changes, and you'll get the people who are concerned about the legal aspects, the policies. I had a long email from a client last week all about the problems of trying to count people's hours when they're working condensed hours, and how do you work out how much holiday they have and so on. And there are some very tangible issues. So whilst we might be talking a bit about the some of, let's call it the softer issues here in terms of the culture of the organization and getting these things in place, you also have to remember there are some hard policy issues as well. It's nice to see some comments coming in now. A very topical one, saying, do you think that leaving the EU will have an impact on flexible working in the UK? I think funny enough, everybody says, we have all this regulation from Europe, which is constraining what we do. It's one area that the UK has led in terms of flexible working employment legislation, where it doesn't appear to have been coming particularly as edicts from Europe. Yes, there have been some constraints on the treatment of temporary workers, for example. So there is a bit of European legislation, European influence on employment legislation. But I think overall, I don't see there's a kind of massive change. Interestingly, I think if the UK did leave Europe, we might end up with us becoming more transatlantic. And if you look at what's happening in the US, you could argue in some areas they're ahead, but in many of the kind of social aspects of work, they're really behind because it's more hire and fire kind of atmosphere. They're less concerned about work-life balance and so on. I think some of that may catch up with them. I think the problem with some of the European stuff is it is a bit regulated. You have the unions with a very strong influence in some countries in Europe, and bureaucracy, the French with their 35-hour week and so on. So I see, maybe in summary, leaving the EU may mean, at least if that happens, we're less constrained by potential European regulation. By the time we finish this webinar series, we will, of course, have had the referendum and we'll know where we stand. So interesting to see what happens later in the year. Another comment from Wendy about being aware that one size doesn't fit all. Absolutely, I think the whole point of flexible working is it is flexible, that it meets the needs of the individuals and the teams. And quite rightly, some teams do have to be in the same place at the same time. Some work does involve people having to be at a fixed time and place. Not all work can be infinitely flexible, of course. But I think what our advice always is start with a blank sheet of paper. Assume that, forget history, and assume that this task, this set of work can be done anywhere, anytime. Now look at why it can't. And when you start with flexibility being the norm and rigidity being the exception, then attitudes towards flexible working changes a bit. And managers understand that in lots of cases where they assumed something had to be done at a fixed place and time, in fact, it doesn't and can be done elsewhere. Okay, comments still coming in thick and fast, which is good. Right, how important is it to ensure that employees get the business case as well? I think absolutely. If we want the culture to change, then employees have to be on site as well. I totally agree. Ultimately, the culture in the organization is the way it feels for employees. So it may be that their manager is trying to move them too fast away from something that they feel comfortable with. For me, the successful implementation of whatever you want to call it, agile-wise, smart working, is something that allows individuals to work the way that suits them best within the business constraint. And that means if somebody wants to work fixed day times, fixed place, because that suits their personal life, then that's just fine. It's not dictating to somebody how they run their life. They may choose to work a fixed pattern. Very often, flexible working is a bad phrase because what happens is we have people who are actually working a fixed pattern. It's just non-standard. So somebody who's part-time will work maybe the same 4 days a week, for example, is not flexible in the sense of changing anything from one week to the next, but is non-standard and hence comes under the kind of flexible working policy. So flexibility is something that is misunderstood at times. Okay, right. Chris, I was asking about how we cover how an organization manages the choices across a number of different work solutions. I think if you don't mind, we might cover that in a future one, Chris, because we will talk more about, as we get into the project, when there are our choices, how do managers manage to look at that, and what the different choices are. At this stage, we're very much focusing on looking at the alternatives and therefore keeping as open a mind as possible, looking at the outside world, saying what's changing, getting together the arguments, doing the background research, as it were, before jumping into implementing a change. So some of that looking at the choices comes later. There will be constraints later, having said, look, here's all the options. Actually, practically speaking, our buildings don't support this, our technology doesn't support this. This option is outside of our culture. I was talking to a client last week who's implemented lots of flexible working, but really struggles with condensed or compressed hours as an option. It's really difficult working with them because of their concern about people working long hours and stress. So there are different solutions for different organizations. And I guess one of the key messages, again, that'll come out through these sessions is, we're not trying to dictate a new way of working for everybody. We're trying to get through this processes, organizations stepping back, thinking about their working practices as part of their business and being more open-minded about alternatives, not trying to preach a specific new world of work. The one new thing, I think, is that it's not going to be a fixed new pattern of work replacing a fixed old pattern of work. It is going to continue to evolve. Right. Last question around incentivizing flexible ways of working, for example, covering travel costs to work from multiple locations. Wow, that's a bit too detailed probably to cover in the last minute or so of this session. But I think incentives, rewards in particular, is a very important part of how new ways of working fits into the existing culture. For example, we always talk about trying to reward output, not input. So rather than paying people or rewarding people for hours, which encourages the long hours culture, actually measuring by results. Then those people who find smarter ways of working, maybe who take work home and they can do it in the peace and quiet and get it done in half the time, that's an example of people being rewarded for working in a different way that meets their needs and the organization's needs. Again, can be a bit of a win-win here. This is not something just for the business. It's not something just for the individual. The successful implementation of smart, wise ways of working is actually one that is good for the individuals and the organization, and that can happen. We're coming up to the end, so I think I'll finish there. Thank you all for your comments and question. That's brilliant. The next webinar in this series is now coming up in April the 14th at midday. And you see that in this phase is the next stage is initiating. So having done this first bit of gathering the information and deciding it's to go ahead, and there are people sometimes who decide we're not ready, it's not right now, don't go ahead. If you got to the stage of saying, right, we've decided, we've done our background work, next stage is now how do we get to this, to get it into the organization, approved right up to the top, so that when we're ready to go with the project, all the groundwork has been laid. As we go through the year, then there'll be one session on proof of concept, and then I think 3 sessions on implementing. So the total, by the time we get to the end of the year, there will be 6 sessions overall. It's now 2:30, so I promised to get you through in half an hour. Thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing many of you at the next session. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.